Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast, your home for nonpartisan political information and analysis. I am your host, Paul Rader. Today we're going to talk about efficient versus deliberative government. Question for you. Do you prefer a government that is swift to respond, or do you prefer a government that thinks things over? In other words, do you want an efficient government or a deliberative government? Are the two inherently at odds? Can we have both efficiency and deliberation? How did the Founding Fathers see this debate? How does this debate apply to the executive, legislative, and judicial branches today? All this and more is on tap for today's episode. But first, this idea was spawned by a LinkedIn post I made the other day. It talked about unicameral versus bicameral legislatures, which is a legislature with one chamber or two chambers, respectively. And I wrote how one of the philosophical debates behind having one or two chambers was based on whether you wanted a legislative structure that was, theoretically at least, more efficient or one that was theoretically more deliberative. And that got me to thinking, can we expand this framework of efficient versus deliberative government further? Because citizens and politicians alike often decry our government as inefficient. They take too long to address problems as they arise. They just have a lot of infighting about what to do. And then they also often deride it as too rash in responses, not taking the time to think things through or accounting for other viewpoints. And at first glance, it may seem like the two camps are at odds. It may seem like everybody wants to have it both ways. But could we have it both ways? Obviously, we'd ideally like a government that comes up with the best policy in the best time frame. So can we? Let's dive a little bit more into this. Let's first define efficient government and deliberative government. So in my context, efficient government is one that reacts swiftly to situations. That is, for example, a major financial crisis like in 2008, a major policy issue. The system is designed to have an expedited response to challenges that arise. And the idea behind it is that there are many issues that it's an imperative to come up with solutions as quickly as possible. You need to address them right away. In the eyes of a supporter of a more efficient government, sees a responsive government as when that problem arises, the government responds by acting quickly to limit the effects of the problem. On the other hand, you have a deliberative government, which is one that takes its time to think things through. The system is designed to consider more options before responding and more viewpoints. The idea is that you need to incorporate as many ideas as possible, or at least hear them out. And so, for a supporter of a more deliberative government, they might see responsive government as one that, when a problem arises, that government responds by taking as much information as possible and devising a solution from there. So you may have noticed the word I used was responsive, a core part of this debate. And again, people don't necessarily think of it in terms of efficient government versus deliberative government, or even see an opposition between the two. But a core part of the debate is about the level of responsiveness from our government officials. Ideally, we want a responsive government, and it should be an ideal we strive for. But how do we define a responsive government? Is it just simply, it just quickly resolves an issue? But what if the response is not what we want it to be? Does that mean that the government was responsive, or did it just do what it wanted to do? Does it have to account for and incorporate as many opinions as possible, even if it doesn't necessarily take all of those opinions? It might have heard, okay, citizen, we heard what you said, but we still think that we need to go this direction, theoretically. Usually that's not going to actually happen that way, but theoretically, would that also be a responsive government? We'd obviously like both of the above. We want them to be quick to resolve a situation, but that we want the government to hear what we have to say. But is that viable? And if it is viable, what context is it viable? Does just hearing people out equal responsiveness? they might be responsive because the government is at least listening, even if they don't ultimately incorporate those ideas. But it also might not be responsive because government never intended to incorporate any of those ideas in good faith. You think about town halls, for instance, or a committee meeting in a state legislature or Congress when the balance of power is heavily lopsided towards one party, even if they're technically hearing out minority viewpoints. Is that really being responsive and taking into account other viewpoints? Well, I mean that's for you to decide, but does more action being taken automatically equal responsiveness? How do we define action being taken? Because what some people see as action being taken by the government, other people don't think that's a real action. And just because the government is acting on something in some way, it doesn't mean that they're actually listening to the people. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. Regardless of the opinion on how to design a government, though, a responsive government is an ideal we should strive for. We should have a government that responds to what we think and feel. Otherwise, what's the point of us even electing them? So let's go back to the founding fathers here and how they saw this efficiency versus deliberative government debate. And they didn't necessarily use the exact words of efficient and deliberative, but when you look at the Articles of Confederation before we had the U.S. Constitution, when we had the Constitutional Convention to make the U.S. Constitution, and in the Federalist Papers, and even going to today, you do see some instances of that efficiency versus deliberative debate. How quickly should government, particularly federal government, be able to respond to situations, and how much should they have to go through a deliberative process? And you can see some of the philosophical influences that the founding fathers had in that regard, like with Montesquieu, who was one of the primary people who espoused the idea of separation of powers, where different branches of government have specific duties that they administer instead of it all being vested within a particular person or a small cabal of people. Or Jean-Jacques Rousseau with the social contract, which is basically the idea that you give up some rights in order to preserve the rest of your rights, where if you didn't have any sort of government structure, there's nothing to protect your personal rights. So you come up with a government that protects some, but you have to give up some level of freedom. So when you think about those, there is a little bit of that efficiency versus deliberation, the efficiency of this separation of powers and how deliberative branches have to be with those separation of powers. And the same thing with things like the social contract, John Locke with property rights, Voltaire with freedom of expression, and a bunch of other philosophers that I haven't even mentioned. But if we go to the Articles of Confederation that we had when we became independent from the British, which instituted a very weak central government. Central government had almost no power unless all the states consented to that federal government doing something that affected the entire nation. Otherwise, the states basically just handled their own affairs. That was definitely not about efficiency, because in every issue of national scale, every state had to be unanimous in consent. And if you've ever tried to get a group of people, whether it's your friends, to figure out what you want to eat for dinner, or if you've ever been on a sports team, even as something as small as a basketball team or something bigger like a football team, trying to get all your teammates to move in the same direction, even if you all have the same goal, which is to win, but to actually do the play correctly, or to not try to puff up your individual stats at the expense of the team, you know how difficult it is to get everybody marching in the same direction. So now imagine the difficulty of getting 13 states with 13 very different sets of interests, because really the only thing that had united them really wasn't that united of a United States. The main thing that really united them was opposition to the British Crown. And even then, there were a lot of Americans that still wanted to stay loyal to the British, and there were a lot of Americans that just wanted to live their lives and not have to worry about the war for independence. They just wanted to be left alone, and whatever happened, happened, as long as it didn't involve them. So the Articles of Confederation, you have to think about the context of the time. Yeah, it was a very flawed document, and which is why we ultimately moved away from it, although that was not universally supported by any means. But when you take the context into account, there's a great distrust of a centralized government due to the Americans' dealings with the British Crown and how they instituted taxation without representation, such as through the Stamp Act. In a way, that British Crown and how that did things was sort of more of an efficiency perspective. It was whatever the Crown said goes, goes, and there's nothing you do about it. Whereas the Articles of Confederation went the complete opposite way and saw things through a deliberative lens, where central government had little say unless all the states consented to it. But that really bogged down things. So you had the flaws of the efficiency aspect, where the British Crown just ran roughshod and did what it pleased. But then you went the other way, where you had a lot of gridlock, especially after the war, the American Revolutionary War, was over. So we fast forward to the Constitutional Convention, and this efficiency versus deliberation aspect became particularly problematic. Well, it was already problematic, but it sort of came to the fore in the Constitutional Convention. I mean, the Constitutional Convention multiple times threatened to dissolve. This idea that oftentimes the founding fathers are romanticized as completely putting aside all of their differences to come together for the common good. But the Constitutional Convention several times almost dissolved. Not even George Washington was going to be able to keep it together. It was more Ben Franklin was really the guy who kept it all together, but that's a little bit of a rabbit trail. But it threatened to dissolve multiple times, and there's partially this whole efficiency versus deliberation. How strong should this central government, this federal government be, and how do you still keep the consent of all of these interests, that is to say, these state governments, how do you still protect those? So this efficiency versus deliberation debate was one of the core debates to resolve, and you saw it in things like, there's a lot of ideas that the framers and the founding fathers came up with, the framers of the Constitution had come up with, that might sound very surprising. Like, for example, whether the presidency should be one or three people. One person is definitely the more efficient aspect, or the more efficient perspective. Three people would have been the more deliberative aspect, where one person was just needed to run the show and make sure that everything is executed and enforces the laws. Obviously, there's people underneath that one person, but otherwise, then you have three chief executives that all need to agree on certain courses of action. Whether the legislature should be bicameral, which we will dive into as a case study later on in this episode. How to implement checks and balances between each branch. How does each branch make sure another branch doesn't become too powerful? How do you protect the efficiency and deliberation aspects there? What powers belong to the federal government and what powers belong to the states? And how many states needed to consent to changes to the U.S. Constitution? Ultimately, the U.S. Constitution did incorporate many considerations for both efficiency and deliberation. And so you think about how some of those debates have come up even today. Back then, the Federalist Papers really reflected a lot of these debates. For example, how, I believe there's James Madison that wrote about this in particular, how states would handle localized matters given their proximity to the local population, especially back then when communication was a lot slower. You didn't have cars, you did not have social media, but federal government would still handle wide-ranging issues. And so you think about some of those debates in the context of today. One of the big aspects of U.S. Constitution, even though the word is not used specifically in the U.S. Constitution, is this concept of federalism. which refers to how the duties and spheres of responsibility for the federal and state governments, how they're divided, how they're split up. And you basically have two types. There's dual and there's cooperative, which we talked about in a couple of other previous episodes in this podcast. But basically, dual is federal government has its own duties separate from the state, and the state has its own duties separate from the federal. And then there's the cooperative, where the federal and state government responsibilities intermingle to some extent. So, what is the most efficient divide in responsibilities between the federal and state governments? And then what criteria need to be met for the federal government to be involved in a state affair? Efficiency versus deliberation. Another aspect, again, not a word that's used in the U.S. Constitution, and I don't believe James Madison used this specific word either, but he does definitely talk about it in, I want to say it's Federalist number 54. I can't remember off the top of my head, but pluralism basically describes, or it's defined as the coexistence, competition, and distribution of power between varying political interests. And so James Madison argued in the Federalist Papers how competing interests would prevent any single one from taking too much power. So there's not a really a number you can put on the varying interests, but they all have this tug and pull where some of them will get their interests put forth and implemented, but they won't be able to usurp so much power that they can trample over other interests. Although that idea of pluralism today, that's not an agreed upon thing. Some people still believe that is working, some people don't. And both the efficient and deliberative supporters could argue that the pluralistic view of government that James Madison and the framers of the Constitution envisioned is working as intended, and there's people in both camps that could say that it's not working well. So for the side that says pluralism is working, or at least that it's working well enough where there's a healthy competition between all these interests and they're being heard out fairly, somebody who supports a more efficient government might say the system is working in allowing these varying interests to compete for quick, effective solutions. As soon as one wins, you see it in political parties. Even though the founding fathers did not necessarily envision political parties, they took to them fairly quickly under the U.S. Constitution. And so these one group would win a majority in government and implement their views, but then you'd have an election come up, and then the next, maybe another group takes power or splits it up. So that's the efficient side. The deliberate side would say that there's a wide variety of interests that are being represented and heard out to come to deliberated solutions. They're saying, okay, you have to take into account a whole bunch of people's views in order to come up to a solution. You're deliberating on it. But both the efficient and deliberative camps might also say that pluralism is not working. And if you believe in a need for government to be more efficient, you might say that hyperpluralism, which is basically that there's so many interests competing that it's bogging down political processes. But you're basically saying that that's running rampant, and there's no real solutions that are coming because nobody's really able to come up with something. There's not really somebody that's able to win and make an effective long-running solution. If you're more of the deliberative side of things, you might say that there's actually relatively few concentrated interests that have taken over the system and stifled the interests and viewpoints of others. So they're not really taking a hyper-pluralist route, but they're saying that the pluralism isn't really actually so plural. Their organized interests tend to beat unorganized interests whenever it comes to all else equal. The organized interests are probably going to win. So the deliberative side is going to say that there's a select few groups of interest that are running the show and are not hearing people out. So that brings us to this next point. What factors does the need for efficiency or deliberation in government depend on? When it's not necessarily that somebody believes we need efficient government in every single aspect, and then other people say we need deliberative government in every single aspect. What contexts might influence whether we want more of an efficient government and we want more of a deliberative government? Maybe somebody wants government in one context to be more deliberative, and then in another context wants it to be more efficient. So the important thing to remember is that neither inherently leads to better policy. So if we have efficient government, potential problems that you have there could be that what's considered efficient is really just haphazard, ham-fisted policy that hasn't taken the time to think things over. It's just we just need to get this solution, and we've already got everything figured out. We don't need to listen to anything else. So the efficient side of things might be a complete disregard for other opinions that can potentially help make that policy better. You're thinking about things over and taking nuances into account and not just assuming you've already got the answer. For example, if we talk about, because the budget right now is a big issue, if we pass a budget to simply avoid a government shutdown, is that inherently better for efficiency? Is that going to cause issues for efficiency in government down the road? But then you've got the other side. There's those issues for efficient government or potential issues that arise from a efficient government. But what about issues from a deliberative government? Well, you might see the use of political grievances to bog down and even stop political processes. What looks like it may be, oh, we're just trying to think things over to come up with the best solution. Maybe somebody's actually using their power to try to slow down the political process, to maybe they're trying to kill a bill that a lot of people think needs to get passed. And it might lead to an untimely addressing of issues that maybe needed a quicker solution. Some solutions are more pressing and more pertinent than others. So, again, if we apply this to the budget, should our level of deliberation on a budget potentially lead to a government shutdown when somebody threatens to try to get the government to shut down because they think that the budget is not fiscally responsible, for example? Is that being truly being deliberative, or is that just being obstinate? So you have these issues that could potentially arise from efficient and deliberative government, and you really need to think things over as to whether things are being efficient or are being deliberative. So several of the contexts to really think about when it comes to efficient versus deliberative government. Does it differ based on the level of government? So by level of government, we mean federal versus state versus local. Do governments closer to home, that is to say local and maybe to a lesser extent the state governments, do they need to be more efficient because they are more local to people? They are closer to the population. And therefore, do governments further away, that is to say federal and maybe in some cases state governments, do they need to be more deliberative because they have more interest to account for? There are more people, and therefore there are more interests to think about. So you can't just take into account only a select few people. Or do governments closer to home need to be more deliberative because they have fewer people to consider and are more directly capable of addressing people's needs, and they need to have time to think? They have the ability to take more time to think things over. And then therefore do governments that are further away need to be more efficient because national and international issues are so wide-ranging and oftentimes very pressing, and they have so many people that they affect. Next context for efficiency versus deliberation. Does it differ based on partisan or ideological bias? Because this debate, I mean, pretty much every other political debate, it becomes ripe for people to play political games with based on whether they support or oppose the party in power. So do we change whether we think we need more efficient or deliberative government based on which party's in power? For example, the people we don't like are in power, so the government is inefficient. So if your party is not in power, you're probably going to want to say that things are being run inefficiently because it's not your interest, and you're trying to win and get your party back in power, or you want to see your party back in power. Or maybe you say, we are in power, but the people who we don't like are trying to bog down the political process. So they say people who the minority party might be arguing they're being more deliberative and they want their voice heard, but the party in power is trying to say they're not being deliberative, they're just being obstinate. If the party or ideology we subscribe to is not in power, do we support a more deliberative government because our voice gets drowned out more, and therefore we want a government more deliberative because we want to have our voice heard, we don't want to be run over? If the party or ideology we subscribe to is in power, do we support a more efficient government because our interests are more likely to be implemented and we can just get them pushed through while we still have the power? How about in the context of the size of the population of the constituency? In other words, do we want a more efficient or more deliberative government based on how many people are being represented by that government? So if we talk about larger versus smaller states, California or Texas versus Delaware or Arkansas, larger or smaller cities, we talk about a place like New York City or Los Angeles versus Carmel, Indiana, or Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Do we need a government to be more efficient or deliberative when there are more people being represented? If there are being more people being represented, the efficient side may say, okay, there's a lot of people that are depending upon this, and we need to get something done for all these people as quick as possible. Or do you say, because there are so many people being involved, we need to think things over, we need to account for more people's views? So the efficient side may say it has a lot of resident needs to attend to, and many require a quick response. The deliberate side might say, because there are so many resident interests to attend to, there are many voices that need to be accounted for and have their ideas incorporated into policy. So those are several general contexts for more of a theoretical view. Let's get more into, there's still some theoretical aspects to this, but let's get a little bit more practical. Let's look at some case studies from the three branches of government, mostly federal, but we'll have some state level stuff too. Let's see how efficiency versus deliberation works in theory and in practice. Efficiency versus deliberation in the context of the executive branch. So the federal government, presidents, cabinet, federal agencies, the state level governors, state executives, and state agencies that fall under their purview. So the executive branch executes and enforces the laws. That is the main general responsibility of the executive branch. The questions to ask about this branch when it comes to efficiency versus deliberation, and these are not the only questions, but a couple of really big ones. How responsive to an issue do we want a president or a governor to be? What parts of federal or state law are subject to a president or governor's interpretation, respectively? Sometimes when the legislature writes a law, there might be something that's vague enough, or a president or governor argues is vague enough, that they have some level of power to interpret it in a certain way or execute the law in a certain way, or that their agencies underneath them have the power to execute it in a certain way. We talk about Chevron deference, which has been struck down by the Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court, but basically was the idea that the executive agencies have some sort of leeway to interpret Congress's laws still within the framework, but they didn't necessarily need to rely on a very specific prescription of how the legislature, in this case Congress, prescribed them as to how they need to act in a certain situation. One recent case study we could talk about is DOGE, or the Department of Government Efficiency, that Elon Musk was running. Definitely an example of the philosophy of a more efficient government. I mean, efficiency was in the name of the department. Now, whether it actually has contributed to a more efficient government is a different question, and that's up to you to decide. I don't get into that. That is definitely can be a heated discussion, but it's an example of that efficiency versus deliberative aspect. It was certainly more along the lines of efficiency because efficiency was in the department's name. But let's look at a bit more of a general context or general case study. Let's look at the size of the executive branch. So over the years, the executive branch has grown considerably, far bigger than the founding fathers thought that it would, more than likely. Now, doesn't necessarily mean that it's done in an unconstitutional way. I'm not saying that, but it has definitely become far, far larger than the founding fathers had seen in their day. So as the government and the population has grown and more policy issues have arisen, the executive branch has expanded accordingly. And now we have many departments and agencies that handle various facets of government. For example, you have 15 cabinet departments for the federal government, like Interior and Justice and Energy and Education. So if we look at the size of the federal branch in the terms of efficient versus deliberate, let's say we want a more efficient government. You could go about this a couple of different ways. You might actually think a larger executive is good, or you might think a smaller executive branch is good. So if you're more of the efficient camp, you might think a larger executive is more efficient because you need more specialized departments and positions and jobs to handle an increasing workload for the government. There's too many issues that are going on, so you need a lot of people to be able to handle all of those things and get everything addressed and responded to in a timely manner. Or supporter of efficient government might think that a smaller executive is needed because they might say that too many departments and positions will bog down the efficiency of government. That was the idea behind Doge. Too many cooks in the kitchen, and that it costs too much money in terms of taxpayer dollars. They have to get the money to fund the government in some way, and primarily that is done through taxpayer dollars. So supporting an efficient government could go either way. A deliberative supporter or a supporter of deliberative government might also support either a larger executive or a smaller executive branch. If they support a larger executive, they might say that more departments are needed to devote time to individual issues because if they're more specialized, they can think things over and account for a whole bunch of different views. And so you need enough people to be able to handle all of those differing views and all that differing information coming in. Or they might support a smaller executive. They might say that fewer departments will keep these people that are in the government more informed on a bunch of different issues and how they interweave together. So they need to think things over more about how all these issues interlock instead of having it spread out across a bunch of different people with differing views on how to apply the law. Or how about we look at efficiency versus deliberation in the context of executive orders, which is in this case mostly in regards to the president, but similar arguments could extend to governors too, because they have their own version of executive orders as well. And we discussed executive orders in at least a couple of previous podcast episodes, including number 18, which was about presidential power and the controversies that surround its expansion. The American Bar Association defines executive order as a signed, written, and published directive from the President of the United States that manages operations of the federal government. And some of these are small scale, and some of these are much more wide ranging. And these wide ranging ones are controversial because they're often seen as a way for the president to circumvent Congress's power to write laws, although the president will say that they're actually acting within the bounds of the law as it is written. They're just simply making sure it gets enforced. We dive a bit more into that specific controversy in that episode 18, so I don't want to go too much into it here, and we're also focusing more on the efficiency versus deliberation aspect here. So somebody who believes in a more efficient government, they're probably more amenable to a president's use of executive orders because there's less reliance on government or Congress to enact policy. They may see executive orders as necessary to get around, in their eyes, inept or ineffective Congress. And they will say that executive orders are allowed by the Constitution to execute the nation's laws. Somebody who supports a more deliberative government probably going to support little usage of executive orders, if at all, because they see it as they need to rely more on Congress to pass legislation, and they see executive orders as unconstitutional and an imbalance of the separation of powers and checks and balances. Or how about we go to the war powers? Basically, what powers does the president have to be able to dictate war, to wage war, to declare war? And that was also discussed in podcast episode number 18, and I believe I had another one that talked about it as well. But the controversies or the debates surrounding it are, what exact powers does the president have regarding the declaration of war? Is it that they're just commander in chief? Do they get to declare war unilaterally? Do they have to get permission from Congress first, or can they declare war and then later on get permission from Congress? It's definitely become, over the past 50 years, a more heated discussion, I suppose, a more pertinent discussion. So if we look at it in the context of efficient government versus deliberative government, somebody who supports a more efficient government is probably going to be more supportive of the president having more wide-ranging war powers, because they're going to say that the president should have more power to declare and or make war, and that he needs to be, or she needs to be able to be swift in responding to international issues concerning warfare, because when it comes to war, it tends to be a very pressing issue. People are dying. People are losing their homes. People are being starved and tortured. And so these people for efficient government will say that the Constitution actually leaves war powers responsibility ambiguous, and that it allows the president to repel invasions of their own authority, and thus leaves power to make war, quote unquote, a concurrent responsibility of both branches. They're saying it as that the U.S. is just executing and enforcing laws. And they'll also say that Congress has willingly ceded war powers without pushing back anyways. On the flip side, somebody who supports a more deliberative government will say that the president should have less power to declare and or make war, and that they need to refer to other branches, particularly Congress, on what to do, because it is such a wide-ranging issue and so many people are being negatively impacted. You need to be able to take the time to think things over about how best to proceed with these issues in warfare. And they'll say that somebody who supports a deliberative government in the context of war powers will say that there's a clear demarcation of power to declare war belonging to Congress, while the president is just the commander in chief, and that the power to unilaterally declare war is an abuse of power that doesn't belong to one person, and that the courts have not stopped the president like they should. So they're saying that not just that Congress should be involved in a more deliberative way, but that the courts need to also have their opinion voiced and try to stop the president from being so involved in war powers, and that he needs to refer to the other branches more often. Now let's move to the legislative branch. So the Congress and the state legislatures. Main responsibility, generally speaking, for the legislative branch is that they write the laws. So some of the questions, not all the questions, but some of the questions to ask about this branch when it comes to efficiency versus deliberation: is an efficient or deliberative process more conducive to productivity of a state legislature? Podcast episode number 40 here was talking about the productivity of state legislatures and Congress and what exactly constitutes productivity. I didn't come up with my own definition. I just brought up some questions to think about when it comes to defining productivity. Like, is it just about how many bills are introduced? Is it about how many are passed? Is it about the percentage of bills that are passed compared to how many were introduced? Not necessarily clear answers. Another question to think about: should legislatures be more efficient or deliberative than the other branches? They are the ones that are devising the laws, after all. I believe it was Alexander Hamilton, and I can't remember what Federalist paper it was, but I believe one of them was talking about why they had a bicameral legislature, and basically were saying that the legislative branch is inherently the most powerful branch, so it needed to have its power split up between two chambers so that it could deliberate more about how to write laws for the nation. And if you only count quote unquote main officials of each branch of government, legislative branch has the most members because you have a Congress or you have state legislatures. The courts, if you talk about specifically just the justices and not the clerks and all the people underneath the justices, and then if you talk about in the executive branch, the president and the cabinet, or a governor and other state executives in a given state, the legislative branch is going to have the most quote unquote main officials. So do we need to have that branch be more efficient because there are so many people, or be more deliberative because there are so many people to account for? So let's go to the case study of the unicameral or bicameral legislature, which was really the thing that spawned this idea for this podcast episode in the first place. That LinkedIn post I talked about, where I was discussing whether somebody who wants a more efficient government, what they would support, and whether somebody who wants a more deliberative government, what they would support. And just to reiterate, bicameral means there's two chambers. So there's a House, or in a few states, they call it an assembly, such as in New York, and a Senate. And in other countries, it might be called something different. Like in Britain, they have the House of Commons and the House of Lords, but it's basically the same thing. And also British, in Britain, it's called Parliament, not Congress. Unicameral is one chamber, and countries that use this system include Denmark, Greece, New Zealand. But in the US, in Congress and all the state legislatures, there are two chambers. They are all bicameral, except Nebraska, because in 1934, voters in Nebraska passed a state constitutional amendment that shifted from a bicameral legislature to a unicameral legislature, and also so it left just a Senate. And that same change also made it the only nominally nonpartisan legislature. Now, the legislators in Nebraska still tend to ally with either the Republican or Democratic parties, but officially they are all considered nonpartisan for the state legislature. So if you are a supporter of a more efficient government, you're probably going to be more likely to support a unicameral legislature, because it's going to be much quicker to pass bills, because you don't have to worry about two chambers. Because if you have two chambers, they both need to not just agree on the basic idea behind a bill, but they need to agree on the exact same wording, down to a T. Everything has to be the exact same for that chamber, or excuse me, for that legislature to pass a bill and then send it to the chief executive, whether it's the president for Congress or the governor for a state legislature. Now, that doesn't mean that just because of that unicameral legislature doesn't mean that that is going to be a good bill. A single chamber can just railroad a bill toward passage without ironing out all the issues. They didn't have two chambers to really deliberate on something. On the flip side, the deliberative argument would be more likely to support a bicameral legislature, because the chambers have to come together to think through how they are going to agree on the same bill. There are competing interests that have to be accounted for and taken into the bill so that both chambers can agree to it. However, this can lead to more political fighting, even if both chambers are controlled by the same party. I can tell you here in my state, with the Florida legislature, the Senate and the House, and the governor too, but especially the House and the Senate, were very much at odds about what the budget should ultimately be for this coming fiscal year. So they are actually in the midst, as I'm recording this, they're in the midst of a special session right now to iron out all the issues for the budget, because they didn't get it done during the regular session. And other states have had that kind of issue before too. So a deliberative government in that context might be bogged down by gridlock. So a pro and a con, at least in theory, for both the efficient side for a unicameral legislature and then the deliberative side for a bicameral legislature. And if you want to extend the efficiency versus deliberative argument to the statistics on bills passed by Congress and state legislatures, just real quick, go through all of those. Again, episode 40 talks more in depth about this, but a few of the facets that were introduced or talked about in that episode were the number of bills introduced, the number of bills passed, and the percentage of bills passed. And so for 2021 statistics, and I got this data from the website Fiscal Note, which is they do a lot of government affairs stuff and data and have a database tracking state legislative bills. The number of bills introduced in 2021 ranged from 436 in Alaska to 16,818 in New York. The number of bills passed, 48 in Alaska to 3,849 in Texas. And then percentage of bills in Massachusetts, there was 0.41% that were passed in 2021 to 81.27% in Colorado. And then if you look at GovTrack, which tracks Congress bill statistics, and this was actually for the whole term of 2021 to 2022 because it didn't break it down into each year. It did it just by each term of Congress. The number of bills passed there, 17,817. Again, that's over 2 years. The number of bills passed was 1,234, and then the percentage of bills passed was 6.93%. So when you're talking about those statistics in the context of efficiency versus deliberation, does introducing and passing more bills mean we are being more efficient? Or does it mean that a majority party is abusing its power and just ramming in ham-fisted legislation to assert dominance? Does passing only a small percentage of bills mean we are being more deliberate? Or is it political gamesmanship bogging down the political process? Because there's been a wide range of numbers in how many bills have been passed in a legislature and or introduced in a legislature and how many were passed, and then therefore the percentage of bills that were passed. Starkly different numbers across states. But does that mean that X state was being more efficient and another state was being more deliberative? Maybe a state was being both. Maybe a state was being neither. Maybe it was inefficient and not deliberative. Maybe it was both efficient and deliberative. It's not really a straightforward question. It's something to really think about a lot more. And then for the second case study for the legislative branch, before we move to the judicial branch, talk about Congress's involvement in confirming presidential nominations for federal courts. And this goes back to episode number 18 of the podcast again, which was the debate about whether the president has too much power in the selection of judges. So thinking about that debate, the efficient side is going to say that Congress does not need to be more involved in judicial selection because they're going to say, well, the president only has the power to nominate, and that bringing Congress into more of a role in the nomination process invites more political factionalism into the process. They're saying it's not being deliberative, it's just being bogged down by gamesmanship. And they'll say it is the U.S. Senate that actually exercises too much power by obstructing the confirmation process on partisan and ideological grounds. Meanwhile, the deliberative side is going to say Congress needs to be more involved in judicial selection because the U.S. Senate advice function, because in the Constitution, it's supposed to be advice and consent, not just consent. They say the U.S. Senate advice function has been largely reduced when they are supposed to provide both advice and consent. So it's not being efficient, it's just being the president railroading their nominees, at least in the eyes of some people who support a more deliberative government. And they'll also say that the threshold for confirmation of judges needs to be raised from a simple majority, saying that a simple majority is really, that's not being efficient. There's just one interests just having their way and not really having to think things over. You're not trying to account for multiple interests and therefore trying to come up with a judge that is more amenable to more people. And they'll say that presidents are far too political in making appointments to what is supposed to be an apolitical branch. Ideally, you want your judges to be completely impartial. If anybody in the government is to be impartial, you want it to be the courts. So, do we want our legislature to be more efficient or deliberative? Or do we want them efficient in certain contexts and then deliberative in other contexts? Something to think about. And now, finally, let's go to the judicial branch, several case studies there. So, we're talking about the Supreme Court of the United States, or SCOTUS, and the state courts. The main general function of the courts is to interpret the laws. And the legal system is bogged down in ways that make it very inefficient because trials can drag on forever. You have superfluous lawsuits that may or may not make it to court. But the importance of many lawsuits also requires some level of deliberation. So, how do we balance the two? To some extent, the nature of efficiency versus deliberation, that debate, it's inherently different for judicial branch versus the executive and legislature. Given that it interprets laws, the judicial branch does, it's naturally a more deliberative branch, but it has issues with efficiency. That being said, though, we can still have some discussion about the structure and function of the judiciary in terms of whether to favor efficiency or deliberation, or maybe you could have both. So, some of the questions to ask about this branch when it comes to efficiency versus deliberation: how many courts do you need to handle caseloads, particularly in the state court system? Because some states have multiple circuits for their intermediate appellate courts. They might call them circuits. They might call them, there's a couple of other terms that they use, and then I'm blanking on what they are right now, but they have several different circuits. And then some of the lower courts may also have circuits as well. Should some of these larger courts be broken up into panels? Like in California, they have some much bigger courts, and they sometimes have panels within these circuits. How many judges need to be on the bench for a court? This is more relevant for state Supreme Courts and intermediate appellate courts. Some of the lower courts will just have one judge. And then what kinds of cases should go before which courts? So, Supreme Court of the United States, everyone agrees it only needs to hear the cases of the utmost national importance, but maybe there are some cases we think should be heard by the U.S. Supreme Court that don't get heard, or we think that for the state Supreme Courts. And in a couple of states, Oklahoma and Texas, they have two Supreme Courts. They're not both, only one of them in each case is called a Supreme Court, but there are two courts of last resort, one for civil cases and then one for criminal cases. And one other question to think about: is there a need for tort reform? So torts are personal injury lawsuits, and tort reform is the whole idea of changing laws related to personal injury lawsuits and which ones can be brought before a court. Do we need a change in that to better supplement efficiency of courts or deliberation for courts? So, first case study to think about here is how many judges should be involved in a certain court case. Because depending on the case and the court with jurisdiction, there might be one judge or multiple judges that take a case. So, for example, a lot of trial courts are just a singular judge, but the U.S. Supreme Court and state Supreme Courts are multiple judges. In the U.S. Supreme Court, it's 9 judges. Some state Supreme Courts are also 9, some are 7, and then some are 5. And then there's a bit more variety in bench size when it comes to intermediate appellate courts. And you might hear about in the news, you might hear about a single judge temporarily halting a federal or state law, while in other cases, it might be a panel of judges that grant an injunction against a law, especially with some of these immigration laws that we've seen recently. Sometimes it's been a federal judge that has, or a singular judge that has granted a stay, whereas in some other cases, not necessarily the immigration laws, but other injunctions might have multiple judges, a panel of judges granting a temporary injunction on a law. If you're a supporter of more efficient government, you might say that we should have fewer judges on a case, because fewer judges for plaintiffs and defendants to argue in front of. So there's fewer judges to have to question defendants, and thus you don't. The idea was necessarily that you don't have a whole bunch more questions from judges to slow down a process. And they'll say that fewer judges can come to a quicker ruling on a case and then write their majority and concurring and dissenting opinions. A majority opinion is one that is considered the official opinion of a court on a case. Concurring opinions are ones that support the majority rule, but they have different reasons for doing so. And then dissenting opinions are the judges who don't agree with the rest of their cohorts, their fellow justices on that bench. They do not support that judicial ruling. Whereas a more deliberative government supporter might say that we need more judges on the case, because more judges with differing views can discuss a case and thoroughly question plaintiffs and defendants. And they'll say that more judges can provide more information on their decisions in their majority concurring and dissenting opinions. And then in the second case study to think about here, should there be state Supreme Courts for both civil and criminal cases? So, like we said earlier, right now, only Oklahoma and Texas have two courts of last resort. They're both technically Supreme Courts, but only one in each state is actually called that state's Supreme Court. Now, this is a case where, for both the efficient supporter or the supporter of an efficient government and a supporter of a deliberative government, could both argue for having two state Supreme Courts or two courts of last resort, and they could argue for one court of last resort. So the efficient side for arguing for or against two courts of last resort, they might say that you do need two courts of last resort because that could lighten the caseload that one state Supreme Court would have. And this would lead to a smaller case backlog, bogging down these highest courts. They don't have to slog through all of them. You could have two different courts to be able to split up the caseload, one for civil, one for criminal. But if supporter of an efficient government might say that there's one, or that we only need one state Supreme Court because it would lessen the cost of government function. So you're having to pay fewer judges, which means less taxpayer dollars that are needed to pay for them and for their legal clerks and all the other people underneath them. And that you don't need to have to devise a new structure below a second court of last resort, and that higher quality judges can handle both criminal and civil cases just fine. On the deliberative side, somebody who supports a more deliberative government, again, they could argue for or against having two courts of last resort. In the case of two courts of last resort, they might say that that is needed because it allows specialized judges to devote time to thinking over respective civil and criminal cases. Somebody who handles a lot more civil law and then somebody who handles a lot more criminal law. A lot of lawyers and judges handle both civil and criminal matters, but in a lot of cases, some of them will have a lot more expertise in criminal matters, and then some will have more expertise in civil matters. But a supporter of deliberative government might say instead that we need one state Supreme Court because that would lead to a consistent, uniform application of law and justice for individuals or groups. They're saying that only one person needs to think these things over, and it's not, if you have a consistent approach, it doesn't lead to issues down the road, which might sound like a little bit more of an efficient argument, but they're saying that these people, that a one Supreme Court can be more consistent and take the time to think these things over in the context of what the law says. And that's going to do it for all these case studies. So I want to leave some final thoughts here about whether efficiency and deliberation are inherently at odds. Efficiency generally looks for quick solutions to problems, while deliberation looks for solutions to be thought over first. So it may seem like they're automatically opposed to each other, but maybe that depends on how we frame things. Some people get a either positive connotation from efficient or a negative connotation from efficient. They might say efficient is, hey, things are working well, they're working at their highest ability that they should, whereas they might say efficiency is actually just a euphemism for ham-fisting railroading policies and rulings. On the deliberative side, deliberation may sound like, in a positive connotation, oh, they're really taking the time to think things over and incorporating things. Others may say that deliberation is just dawdling and just taking their sweet precious time when something needs to be addressed right away. So be careful not to get weighed down by wanting efficiency or deliberation for government simply for the sake of having efficiency or deliberation. Maybe there are some contexts where efficiency would be better, and then there's other contexts where deliberation would be better. You don't necessarily need to think in those specific words and having those specific words on the top of your head, but the general ideas between how you're trying to get government to function are going to incorporate those ideas, whether you're trying to get government to swiftly respond to things or whether you're trying to get it to incorporate as much information as possible. Some cases, an efficient approach may be needed. Other cases, a deliberative approach may be needed. There's no easy answers for that. But as demonstrated in several of these case studies we discussed, efficiency and deliberation are not always inherently opposed. They may be in agreement, but for different reasons. Go back to a couple of those case studies. Somebody who supports a more efficient government may favor a larger executive since there are so many different policies and a large population and specialized needs that they need to be able to have a larger executive to be able to run the government smoothly and address all these issues. Deliberative a supporter of deliberative government might also favor a larger executive branch, but for a different reason. They may say that a larger executive allows more people to devote time to executing different parts of the law. They're able to account for varying interests. But efficient and deliberative supporters might also oppose a larger executive branch. For somebody who wants a more efficient government, they may say a larger executive is a case of too many cooks in the kitchen, and that it's not really leading to an efficient response. It's just bogging things down because it's too bloated, and they'll say it just costs more taxpayer dollars. Deliberative supporters may also oppose a larger executive branch because it prevents members of the branch from being informed about a wide variety of policies and how they interweave. It's getting spread out by too many people, and they don't necessarily need to communicate with each other. Or we take it in the context of these two state Supreme Courts or two courts of last resort in the judicial branch. And this is more for the state level. This is not something that's going to change for the federal level. And this U.S. Supreme Court operates a little bit differently than state Supreme Courts do anyways, in terms of what kinds of cases they take and why they take some of those. So if you talk about two courts of last resort, somebody who wants a more efficient government may favor it to lighten the caseload that would be on one state Supreme Court. It would lead to a smaller backlog of cases that are bogging down the highest courts. But somebody who supports a more deliberative government may also favor two state Supreme Courts because it allows judges to specialize in civil and criminal cases. They can think things over and account for a bunch more information. They don't have to put it all on one state Supreme Court. But both efficient and deliberative supporters may also oppose two state Supreme Courts because it would, for an efficient supporter, it would increase taxpayer costs because you're having to have two Supreme Courts or two courts of last resort, and the people that are beneath them, they all got to get paid, and that increases taxpayer dollars because it's a government entity. And so government function costs more, and you would also need to revamp the legal structure. And then for somebody who supports a deliberative government, they may also oppose it, but because it may lead to an inconsistent application of law and protection of personal rights based on which court hears the case, there really needs to be a more uniform application of the law, and it's just one person that has the experience is able to think things over. So, in those contexts, you could potentially have an efficient and a deliberative government, depending on how you implement the ideas. But as the case studies show, there is a difference between the theoretical and practical sides. Things that seem efficient at face value may not be efficient at all. Seemingly deliberate things may not be deliberate at all. The things that are efficient might just be somebody just railroading in what they want to happen. Somebody who's being deliberate may just be trying to slow down the process because they're not getting their way. But maybe the most efficient way to do something is also the more deliberative. So basically, the idea here, just hopefully think things over more, because at face value, you want the government to be more efficient, but you also want it to incorporate more opinions, unless, well, it might depend on whether you support the people that are in charge, whether it's federal government or state government. So just be careful that your biases are also not influencing whether you support efficient or deliberative government. It's definitely something that really needs to be talked about more. Maybe not necessarily in these specific words with this specific terminology, but it really does have a lot of implications for the best forms of governance and in terms of how the government functions and how it's structured. So hopefully we can have some of these issues resolved in some way now, whether in terms of whether some aspects of government need to be more efficient, whether some aspects need to be more deliberative. That's up to you to decide. But hopefully, this has just gotten the mental gears churning and twisting and turning in that regard. But that is going to do it for today's episode of the podcast. As always, thank you so much for listening. Please like, comment, and subscribe and share this podcast. It's on YouTube, it's on Spotify, and it's on Apple Podcasts. Hopefully, we'll expand it more in the near future. Links in my show notes, my Facebook, my LinkedIn, Matchmaker FM profile. If you want to potentially be a guest on this podcast or you want me as a guest on your podcast, my educational email course about the mistakes we make when trying to depolarize politics and how we can correct those mistakes, and also why we make those mistakes, but then also ultimately correct those mistakes. My book, Why Independents Rarely Win Elections and How They Become More Competitive, and believe that is it. So, as always, thank you so much for listening and hope you enjoyed this. And until next time, take care.